could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do as it applies to our theme of the conscious nomadic lifestyle?
My name's James Oroc. I'm originally from New Zealand. I'm an author, photographer, journalist, and archive builder. And I have spent more than 25 years traveling the world, pursuing extreme sports such as paragliding, skiing, mountain biking, kite surfing, things like that. And the last few years I've been traveling, lecturing about my book, Tryptomine, which I wrote, which is about the rare entheogen 5-MEO DMT, and that's also given me, allowed me to investigate a number of shamanic cultures around the planet. So most of my travel has been a mixture of either curiosity or journalism or self-study, I guess you'd call it.
Did you become mobile as a necessity for your business lifestyle, or did you plan your business around your desire to be mobile?
Yeah, I think I planned my life around my desire to be mobile, and the businesses fell into place that allowed those things to keep running. My interest in sports journalism it was interconnected with my interest in the sports themselves. One of the reasons I really enjoy doing things like climbing and paragliding is I think it breaks down the barriers between the locals and the travellers. These days there's a lot more tourists around than there were a few years ago. I think we've sort of had a couple of phases of planetary nomadism. I think one of the best ones was probably from the 60s through to the mid-80s, and I caught just the tail end of that. A lot of my friends are a little older than me. We're doing a lot of travelling to places that we can't really go to anymore. Lake Dale Lake and Kashmir was a favourite with a bunch of my friends, and a lot of my friends spent a lot of time in West Africa, Zaire and such places right before the long knives came out. So I think as the world's getting more and more dangerous, it's easier to travel around these days, but there's also more risks attached to it, and there's also people just know that we're there now as travellers. That we used to be something of a novelty, and now we're just a source of income. And I think paragliding especially has been a great way to break through that, because when we fly paragliders, we launch at one spot, we try and fly as far away as we can, often 50 or 100 miles. So when you drop down in some little village you've never been to in the middle of nowhere, and the local priest comes out to check, make sure you're not a vampire or something, and the kids are all running around, you've effectively broken that barrier between just being a tourist anymore. Now you might as well be an alien dropped in from outer space. People are really curious what you're doing and why you're there, and a lot of the barriers drop away. So I tend to get a little bored these days if I'm not travelling for some kind of sporting purpose, or something that breaks those barriers and helps me interact with the local people more effectively.
Well, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but what do you find your motivation is now, and how does it differ from when you first started the nomadic lifestyle?
I think my motivation's always been the same. I'm just understanding it better, and that's to understand myself better.
What are some of the most important skills or abilities that have enabled you to become more sustainable as time goes by?
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, our whole culture's been changing so quickly. Like when I first started doing sports journalism, it was a huge effort to actually get your work to the publisher. Especially if photographs were involved, slides. And these days, it's so easy. And a lot of my publishers expect me to be doing stuff real time. I think as a journalist, we're now moving away from writing long, detailed pieces about places to doing short bursts with video and interviews, and the whole culture of what people expect is changing. So I've just had to keep changing with that as much as anything, and I think that's made it a little bit more sustainable in the sense that it's made it easier, but I haven't really had much to do with that other than keeping up with the technology.
Do you feel what you're currently doing is the highest expression of this offering, or do you envision it evolving in some way into something else?
Because I'm an author and a writer, my traveling and my writing are inexorably linked. One fuels the other, and I think that's a lot of the reason a lot of writers have been nomadic, is that it keeps the creative juices flowing. There's nothing like a change of scenery and circumstances to start your processes in a different direction. So, I don't know that there's a highest ideal. I would like to be free to move around a little bit more easily again. And I'm kind of at the point these days where I actually am fairly depressed, maybe the right word, maybe not the right word. I'm not very hopeful for the future of humanity, and I want to see as much of the amazing things that we have created while I still can. I want to see the great mountains of the world. I want to see Lake Baikal, some things like that. And I think I have developed a personality that really only trusts what it sees with its own eyes and experiences up front, And I think that's probably the most valuable thing traveling does for you, is it gives you your own worldview, which is much more sophisticated than someone that doesn't actually travel or go anywhere, because their worldview is pretty much based on propaganda these days.
Well, that brings up a question in my mind. Believing only what you see with your own eyes, how does that translate to the book you wrote on tryptomines?
Well, that book's very much my experiences about my change in worldview, where I went from being a fairly cynical scientific rationalist who was very atheistic in my worldview to, in one experience, to a much more spiritual, God-encompassing worldview. So that was a pretty hard thing for me to understand. I spent a number of years trying to figure out why I had gone through these changes, somewhat successfully, I think. Sorry, I forgot the start of that question.
Yeah, no, just with the tryptomine, like 5 MEO experience, you have your eyes closed, but you're still perceiving. So
yeah, your eyes can be wide open, it doesn't really matter. And in many ways it's the ultimate journey, because you actually split from your physicality and your consciousness goes on a journey, and your meat stays home for a different kind of experience.
Right.
I often get asked if I want myself videoed, while I smoke. And I don't, because I really have no interest in what my meat's up to flopping around on the floor, because it can't go for that journey. And I think that's one of the reasons nomads and tryptomines go together well, because it is the origin of the word trip, really. Tryptomines would make a trip. That's how they work.
Beautiful. What are the most exciting aspects of what you do?
I feel very free. I see a lot of people who are trapped and tied into their lives and don't really think that they can do anything different. And I think one of the best things you can do is go to another country with limited resources and realize that you'll survive anywhere, anytime, because that really gives you the ultimate freedom, the freedom to be able to move around and make your own choices based on optimism rather than on fear. I think there's anywhere in the world I could go and survive.
What are the most tedious tasks or parts of this lifestyle?
There are times when it's lonely, and there are times when you get stuck in places you don't really want to be, and it's a bit rough. But like as they say, this too shall pass. One of my favourite authors is a guy called Bruce Chatwin, who wrote a great book on nomads called The Songlines. But he also wrote another great book of short pieces. He was a buyer for Sotheby's, or one of the big auction houses, and he was an art expert, so he travelled super extensively for many, many years. And he wrote a great book of short stories, of short pieces called What Am I Doing Here?, which I always think is a great title, because every traveller's had that what am I doing here moment. But I'd rather have a couple of what am I doing here moments than several years of what am I doing stuck here.
What are some of the things you find attractive about the mobile lifestyle?
I just like to feel the flow of human culture in all its infinite variety of forms. Its food and its music and its art and its architecture and the more you move around, the more you appreciate the diversity of human life. I think being stuck in one place, voluntarily or involuntarily, is you tend to be fed a certain concept of what's reality or what's society or what's anything, and you go other places and you realize that those concepts are quite fluid and changing, and that we make those concepts up. They aren't made for us.
Tell us about some of your favorite places or events to which you've traveled.
Well, because I've done a lot of sport-orientated stuff, I tend to go to a lot of out-of-the-way little holes, places people probably never heard of, like Bay de Bravo in Mexico, or Bear in India, or Mancora in Peru, places like that. There's a lot of places I really enjoy. Most recently, I think the place that's touched me the most is a place called Chavin in Peru. I spent a bunch of time in the main Peruvian Andes, and I went to this place called Chavin, which is an ancient ceremonial San Pedro temple in the Andes that you could really feel the specialness of that place, and it helped me, I think, understand South American culture, or the original South American culture, a lot better just by having visited it and feeling how it worked. And once again, obviously I have certain interests in the psychedelic field. When I got to Chavin and I saw the way the place was set up, it was very obvious that it was a psychedelic site. It was surrounded by San Pedros. They have a series of tunnels that go underground, and they would have the main area where they would make the brew, and they would give you the San Pedro, and then you would go underground through this tunnel complex where there were like beams of light and little waterfalls, and apparently priests would hide with conch shells. And when you come to the center of it, there's a massive stone carving that looks like something Luke Brown would have done 3,000 years ago, all done without metal tools. And the Chavinian culture conquered the rest of the South American tribes by basically bringing their leaders to this place and sending them through the experience. And when they came out the other side, they just signed up to the Chavinian lifestyle. There was no war involved. It's kind of the South American Eleusis, as far as I can tell. And but I having read a great deal about this place since, our modern archaeologists don't really like to deal with the entheogenic component of civilizations. So you'll see some mentions of it being used as a psychedelic site, but it's somewhat controversial. But when you see it with your own eyes, from a psychedelic perspective, it's very obvious what was going on there. So I'm glad that I stumbled across that place and now have my own view of what Chavin is about, as opposed to the view I would get if I was looking through guidebooks and such things. So I think that's the important thing, is just seeing things and making up your own mind. A number of years ago, in the 80s, I got caught in Algeria when there was some massive rioting going on. And I was within a couple of months of Tiananmen Square, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but my understanding is there were people protesting in the main square of the capital, Algiers. And we'd just ridden on a bus, and the bus station wasn't very far away from the main plaza, and there were thousands of people protesting that they wanted to bring around a more Islamic rule and get away from the military dictatorship. And the plaza was surrounded by soldiers, and the general ordered the colonel to open fire on people protesting. The colonel refused. The general shot the colonel dead. The troops opened fire on the protesters, killed 700 people, and one of the soldiers was so disgusted he shot the general. And this was within weeks of Tiananmen Square. It got very little press coverage in the West, and I only found the details months later when I was in France. I managed to go back through the French newspapers and figure out what I'd found myself in the middle of. We knew there was a bunch of chaos, obviously, but I was pretty young at that point, and that was an eye-opener to me, that the world was so fascinated by what was going on at Tiananmen Square, but they were quite willing to ignore a significant massacre that had gone on because it was about an Islamic government which didn't fit into the way they wanted it covered. So I think those are the kind of things that traveling gives you, is you get these experiences and you realize how much we're being manipulated.
Exactly. What advice would you give to somebody wanting to follow a similar path?
Start. So many people say to me, oh, I'd love to do what you do. And it's like, well, have a go. Just do it. I mean, literally, I left New Zealand with 1,000 New Zealand dollars, which was about $500 US at the time. A one-way ticket and a pair of skis. And the road just opened up. I think if you start walking down the road, it will open up. Very rarely does the road end.
Any last thoughts that you would like to share with our viewers?
Just get out and see things while you can, because our culture our consumerism culture is consuming all the other cultures on the planet. The greatest diversity of different cultures on the planet was probably about the year 1500, and since then, since we've bumped into each other, we've just obliterated the cultures we don't like. Wade Davis, who's the National Geographic's Explorer in Residence, has a fascinating program called the Vanishing Languages Program, where they're treating the world's languages much the way we would treat any species that's becoming extinct. And they've been mapping how many languages there once were and how few there now are. Every time we lose a language, we're losing a whole system of thought that's spent thousands of years of being developed, and we're just discarding towards a planet where soon there'll only be something like 25 major languages, once there were once hundreds or thousands. So I think this is, as evolved human beings, we need to have as much contact with these disappearing cultures so we can remember that our culture is not the only one. Well, I think one of the most valuable aspects of travelling is it helps you develop a kind of sixth sense. Anytime you're in countries where you don't really understand the language, you're in towns you've never been in, you're by yourself, you have to learn to judge people and trust people. And I find travellers are pretty trusting because they've learned that they have to trust people. You can't travel without putting your life in other people's hands at certain points at certain times. So I think this is a really useful and valuable inner skill that we develop. You mentioned mountain climbing before. Mountain climbing is the same kind of thing, where you go up a mountain. And people who've never climbed mountains don't realise how convoluted the surface of a mountain really is. It's never a straight line, direct thing. There's always many, many choices you have to make on the way up. Are you going to go left? Are you going to go right? And those choices get made from an inside place that's not so rational, as more instinct-based. I think that's the same set of skills you develop when you're travelling, as you develop better instincts for people and places and situations, and ultimately about yourself. So I think that's what makes travelling the most useful, is it helps you learn about yourself.
Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.